Hello, and welcome to today's COMtalk's discussion, Breaking News, Healing Minds, Protecting Journalists' Mental Health. My name is Mariette DiChristina, and I'm the Dean of the Boston University College of Communication. I'm also an alum of the college and the parent of a recent BU grad. Today's session is being recorded and will be available later on COM's YouTube channel. Journalists play a critical role in informing the public about current events and pressing issues. Yet the demands of their work and the pressures of a 24-hour news cycle often expose them to significant trauma, leading to conditions such as PTSD, both in newsrooms and out on the field. Today's conversation will explore ways to support journalists' well-being, both in the newsroom and on the ground. We'll discuss strategies for improving mental health resources, fostering resilience, and ensuring the long-term sustainability of journalism as a vital public service. After the moderated discussion, there'll be time to answer your questions a little later in the hour. And when you do, please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen at any time. Please use that rather than the chat. Now let's welcome our panelists. Please join me in saying hello to Kim Bryce, who is co-founder, trainer, and coach for the Self-Investigation. She provides personal leadership and burnout prevention and recovery coaching, as well as mindfulness-based stress reduction and resilience trainings to journalists and change makers. She has supported journalists from dozens of media organizations around the world, including The Guardian, Volant Media, Zeit Online, and through the European Journalism Center, the International Center for Journalists, the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, and the World Association of Newspaper Publishers. Earlier, she served as global freedom of expression activist and a founder and then organizational advisor to many media, journalists, and social justice support programs around the world. Thanks for joining us so much today, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it. Then now let's welcome Bruce Shapiro, who is Executive Director of the DART Center and Journalism Trauma Support Network, a project of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism that encourages innovative reporting on violence, conflict, and tragedy worldwide. An award-winning reporter on human rights, criminal justice, and politics, Bruce is a contributing editor at The Nation and U.S. correspondent for Late Night Live on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's Radio National. He is an adjunct professor and senior advisor for academic affairs at Columbia, where he teaches journalism ethics. His books include Shaking the Foundations, 200 Years of Investigative Journalism in America and Legal Lynching, The Death Penalty, and America's Future. Ben is recipient of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies Public Advocacy Award for, quote, outstanding and fundamental contributions to the social understanding of trauma. He is also founding board member of the Global Investigative Journalism Network. Thank you so much for being here today, Ben.
Bruce, but I'm really glad to be here.
Sorry, thank you.
Ben Shapiro is the other guy.
I'm so sorry. Did I say Ben? I'm really sorry.
It was also my grandfather's name, so it's thoroughly honorable.
Yes, I'm awfully sorry. I obviously it's late today for me. My apologies. Thank you. Now I'd love to welcome our moderator and fellow BU alum, Sarah Cass. Sarah is a Boston-based journalism educator and administrator who specializes in the study of trauma-informed journalism and narrative nonfiction. She is presently an adjunct lecturer in the Department of Journalism at Boston University and associate director of BU's Power of Narrative Conference. Over to you, Sarah, and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariette. Thank you to everyone for being on this call. As Mariette mentioned, if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A box as we're chatting. And thank you again so very much, Bruce and Kim, for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. You're both very well versed in the topic at hand, so I know we're all really looking forward to hearing your perspectives. We'll get right into it, and Bruce, I'll start with you. As the longtime executive director of the DART Center, you've seen up close the relationship between journalism and mental health. So can you just set this up for us a little bit? What are some of the biggest reasons why mental health is such a big challenge for journalists? And have you noticed any shifts, especially in the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's a really good way to begin the conversation. And, we're having this conversation at a moment when there really is a lot of discussion within the profession about issues like PTSD and burnout and wellness generally. And that's a welcome, long overdue conversation that's being driven in part by gradually building knowledge, campaigning within news organizations, and especially by a younger generation of journalists who are raising their voices in really helpful ways to drive the conversation forward. Okay. I think it's important to know, first of all, that in journalism, we are by nature in a high stress, high demand profession, right? I don't know most of the people, I'm sure, in the Zoom room today, but there's one thing I know about everybody. They are probably, to a person, completely hopeless stress monkeys, right? Because who else goes into this profession? People who are driven, in a profession driven by daily or hourly deadlines, by sources that are constantly churning and changing. Journalists are very good at mobilizing inner resources to meet deadlines and to fulfill the profound ethical mission of journalism that is true and accurate and rigorous and fun and all of the things that good journalism needs to be. But there are some built-in challenges to our work. One is simply stress, right? Open-ended, unremitting stress can take a toll on the brain and body in any profession. And when, and has been, as has been the case in the last couple of years among news professionals, you've got open-ended, unremitting stress coming from several directions at once, from one crisis after another, from pandemic to police violence to election to pick your poison. And added to that are the growing number of threats and higher level of abuse directed at journalists. And added to that is profound economic insecurity and technological and business churning within our industry. You have a recipe for stress, which in and of itself can sometimes overwhelm a news professional's capacity to do the job or to be the person they want to be. Secondly, journalism is by definition a trauma-facing profession. A huge percentage of what we report on, no matter what our beat technically is, a huge percentage of what counts as news are the worst things that happen to people, from street crime, intimate partner violence, all the way up to war and human rights, disaster, climate change. All of these are central to the news agenda for a good reason. It's not just about eyeballs and clicks. All of these things represent big disruptions in the social fabric, and bearing witness to those is part of the journalist's job. But that too can come at a cost. Directly witnessing and confronting traumatic events, carrying the stories of our vulnerable sources, interviewees, collaborators on our souls, the steady diet of graphic imagery, which thanks to user-generated content and body cam videos and everything else is a huge part of the news profession. Dealing with that higher level of threat, and of course the intersection of all those trauma streams with whatever personal biographical trauma journalists may sometimes carry, or with personal identity threat that comes because of race or gender or sexuality. All of those things can sometimes overtop a journalist's ability to metabolize difficult events and lead to some enduring challenges. But now I do want to say this. We know from 25 years of studies of news professionals all over the world, we know two really important things, which may seem contradictory. One is that we are exposed through all of those channels to far more trauma than the general public. And that is a serious occupational health risk alongside the stress that we talked about, which can lead to burnout. But we also know something else. In the face of all the stress and in the face of this high level of exposure, journalists are a resilient profession, right? We get into this work often in part because we have enormous reserves of resilience. that can be nurtured and right, we're born with, and that we cultivate as we go through life, the ability not to be unaffected by stress, but to bounce back, to cope. And secondly, there are important elements of the work itself, the very job which exposes us to threat and trauma, are also well-established, well-studied resilience factors. Having a job to do in the face of mayhem, having craft skills, having ethics and a sense of mission, having trusted colleagues, most of all of those are buffers against the impact of stress and trauma. So we actually, in talking about journalism and mental health, do need to reckon with the ability of issues like trauma and stress to overwhelm the mechanisms we rely on most of all every day, the ability to concentrate, to focus, to build trusting relationships, all of those things. And at the same time, we don't want to over-pathologize ourselves as a profession. We are good at managing stress and trauma overall. We know a lot about how to cope, and we can lean into that as we try to address what is a serious occupational health risk that comes from overwhelming stress and overwhelming trauma that we want to be aware of.
Thank you for laying that out so helpfully for us. Kim, I'm hoping you can help us define some terms. Bruce mentioned trauma and stress and burnout, and these are all things that come up a lot when we're having this conversation. Can you help us get a sense of how these things are different, what they are, how they present differently, so that we can have an understanding of the similarities and differences here with these terms that we're going to be using in this conversation.
Sure. So I'll talk about stress and burnout, and I'll let Bruce talk about trauma, since that is specialization. But look, one of the things, just to add to what Bruce was saying, is, journalism is a calling. Right? It's not just a job. And I think that's part of our resilience. And stress is not a bad thing in and of itself. In fact, a moderate amount of stress is what allows us to get through our day and to get things done and to meet the deadlines and all of the, things that we need to do in our daily life and in our job. And stress, what's important to know, we all have it and it's normal. And what stress is actually a physiological change that happens in the body when we are subjected to some kind of a trigger, something, a person, a situation, a thing, that for whatever reason we assess as being too much for us, or that we might not be able to cope with or deal with or successfully achieve. So, it's a deficit between what the resources we think we have in us and the demands put on us. And that hormonal shift that happens in the body has an effect, like Bruce talked about, on our body and mind. And we go into a stress reaction, which ignites part of our nervous system that turns on our fight, flight, freeze response. And if we don't learn how to manage whatever it is that triggers us and that keeps us in that stress cycle, that's when we get into trouble. Now, burnout is completely different. And maybe it's helpful. I'll put up a slide because I thought maybe some people it's helpful to see images. So burnout is different in the sense that it is, like all the other things Bruce was mentioning, it is an occupational hazard. It's not a disease. It's not a health hazard. And it comes from chronic workplace stress that goes unmanaged. So in addition to all of the things that Bruce was talking about, what the self-investigation is seeing and what we know from burnout, is that some of the things, the other occupational hazards, are work culture within the media. And these are typical things that most journalists come across that are likely to lead to burnout. Unfair treatment at work, also especially for minorities or disadvantaged groups, they are more of a risk factor than others. The workload and unmanageable workload, the lack of clarity or having to multitask, and now because of the economic challenges that so many media companies are going through, you have journalists having to do many more jobs, many more different tasks because there are fewer staff. So multitasking and going beyond your job description, communication and support from your manager and recognition, and time pressures. And some of these things just come with the job, but that makes journalists susceptible. And just to say, so that's the difference between stress and burnout. Stress is something that happens daily to a small or large amount. And when we are subjected to too much stress for too long, either because we don't know how to manage it, we're not aware of the signals, or we're in an environment, a work environment, or in a personal situation that is adding additional stress than what we normally experience, we can get sick, whether that's physically or mentally. So maybe Bruce, you can come in. So what's the difference? So when does stress, and some say burnout can lead, also eventually to trauma, to PTSD.
My understanding of stress and trauma are that they can be, Kim, as you're saying, related, but they involve somewhat different mechanisms, right? Stress, as you said, burnout is about open-ended, unremitting workplace stress that has gone unmanaged for too long, right? And that's the WHO's definition, as your slide showed. Chronic workplace stress that has been unmanaged, which on a scary day sounds kind of like my career and the career of everyone I know in journalism, right? But actually, there are a lot of dials to tweak and a lot of things built into how our brains and bodies metabolize stress and what leaders can do. I loved your slide talking about how much leaders are responsible for thinking about the stress load in the bands. Trauma is a little bit different. Trauma is rooted in our survival mechanisms as a species, right? All of us are deeply wired to survive overwhelming threat, terror, cruelty, or a steady onslaught of threat that's unremitting over time. And we do that by mobilizing resources to survive. And Kim mentioned the fight, flight, or freeze response, that animal response that enables us without thinking about it to outrun tigers that want to eat us for lunch, right? And to get through truly terrifying situations. The numbing, the shutting down of the body's responses and the brain's responses that happens sometimes in situations of extreme terror, that helps people not feel pain, that controls the stress of the environment, the numbing, the shutting down, and also the flagging, fight, flight, freeze, but also the flagging of terrifying events in memory, in a special kind of memory circuitry, so that we don't have to be chased by tigers twice. These are healthy, appropriate, normal, but overwhelming responses that are built for moments of great threat. Trauma really comes when overwhelming fear, terror, cruelty, or steady threat mobilize these inner resources, blow the valves, and then people don't so easily calm down back, or don't self-regulate anymore. And in particular, it has to do with memory, right? Trauma is about overwhelming events that are stored in a different part of the memory from normal, everyday autobiographical memory. Trauma, memories of profoundly threatening events, are more easily evoked than normal autobiographical memory. And there's a reason. We're wired to survive, to recognize threat. The problem is that in a terrifying moment, our brains have been kind of capturing not only the tiger that wants to eat us for lunch and is staring at us out of the bushes, but the color of the sky, what's on Spotify, everything else going around us, which gets associated in kind of a memory net of a network of associations, along with even our own body's reactions. And if we respond to that tiger with overwhelming fear, the next time we see a tiger, it's going to evoke that same fear. The next time we experience the sky, it may evoke that same fear. Trauma is the persistence of threat-initiated responses when the threat is no longer present. And there are trauma reactions, some of which are mild, some of which are more extreme, some of which are persistent. We throw around the word PTSD very loosely today. That's a very specific diagnosis. But one way to think about trauma is psychological injury, an enduring change in the aftermath of overwhelming threat. One of the clinicians who we work with at the Dart Center, a great psychologist named Kate Porterfield, who has treated a lot of journalists, but also treats torture survivors and others in extreme situations, likes to describe the imprint of trauma as biopsychosocial. It alters us sometimes on 3 levels at once. At the biological level, there is that triggering, that evocation of bodily responses, sometimes of being flooded, feeling too much memory, too much agitation. Sometimes the opposite, the shutting down that Kim talked about, the numbing, or the brain being overwhelmed and becoming very avoidant, not wanting to experience those things. That's purely biological. Or whipsawing between those two, a classic trauma marker between feeling too much and shutting down. Secondly, there's the meaning making. We're a meaning making species, and in journalism, we're in a meaning making profession. And trauma, the constant reliving in the body of profoundly threatening experiences affecting ourselves or people we identify with closely, can profoundly change the meaning making. People can go negative, become the bad news express, see nothing but bad outcomes. And then there's the social. We're a social species who are wired to attach. In journalism, our work is entirely social. All we all do is find stuff out from one person and tell it to a whole bunch of others. Our profession is based on trust-building relationships with sources, with colleagues, with viewers, readers, downloaders. When trauma disrupts those mechanisms, when people's ability to concentrate or focus or be in the moment as a journalist is disrupted by the biological imprint of trauma, that can profoundly undermine people's ability to work. Sometimes journalists can get trapped in avoidance spin cycles or become just very difficult to be around because they're too jumpy, too aroused. When meaning making is disrupted, when people become overwhelmed by constant negative responses that are the result of reliving involuntarily bits of traumatic experience, that can wreck news judgment and make people very difficult colleagues to work with. Most of all, I think, when our ability to forge trusting relationships is disrupted by traumatic events that disrupt our own ability to trust others. The way anyone who's reported on something like a mass shooting knows that that those parents who lost a child in a school shooting, or that child who lost a parent to police violence, may find it very difficult to trust. When we as journalists find it difficult to start or maintain trusting relationships, to believe in the social contract that underlies journalism, it can really destroy our ability to function effectively. And those 3 together the biological, the psychological, and social imprint of trauma can really pull the rug out from beneath a journalist's professional efficacy or personal life. Now, I should say, it's important to remember that there's a huge difference between distress and trauma. What we know from studies is that a lot of times when we cover distressing events as journalists, we're going to feel bad. We can have trauma reactions, bits and pieces of these reactions that we'll experience in the short run and that will feel disruptive, but that we will recover from naturally, or which we can recover from even more easily, but if we get help or talk to colleagues or do other things to mitigate. True psychological injury, PTSD or other enduring psychological injury in the wake of trauma, is less common. But when it does happen, the mechanisms that are involved, when a journalist's personal capacity to metabolize trauma is overtopped, the specific neurological mechanisms involved are the ones that we depend on every day in our work. And that's why the load can be singularly toxic. It's also one last thing, and then I'll shut up. It's really important to know that all of these trauma reactions that are biopsychosocial are not limited to directly witnessing events. All the research for a generation shows that a steady diet of graphic imagery or a steady diet in your professional life of taking on people's stories and testimonies can get processed in the same threat circuitry of the brain as direct exposure and can lead to the same kinds of trauma reactions as directly witnessing violence or mayhem or experiencing threat. You'll hear people, we'll talk later, I'm sure, about vicarious or secondary PTSD. That's not a different kind of trauma. It's just about the pathway that where trauma, is the source a direct event, or is it that steady diet of graphic imagery in a professional context, which is included in the latest updates of the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder, interestingly enough.
Thank you. And I want to circle back on something that you both have been mentioning, which is that there is a responsibility for newsroom managers and newsroom leaders to kind of help their reporters reduce burnout and reduce stress and kind of minimize this exposure to trauma. Are there examples, Kim, maybe, do you know of any best practices by successful managers that you can talk to us a little bit about for when the responsibility is on the newsroom leaders? What does that actually look like when someone's doing that well?
Well, what I want to start out with is saying, integrating well-being or mental health into a work culture should not depend on an individual manager. You might happen to be lucky and have a good manager, and so in your team, good things happen. So it needs to be part of a value. That's the first thing. A company's value, as much as any of the other drivers of what the company's goals are. The other thing, that means that there needs to be buy-in from the top, not just from the middle management, which often, again, as I said, you might end up with a good manager, but there needs to be buy-in from the top. That is the ideal situation. The other thing is psychological safety. Psychological safety is the foundation for being able to integrate, a work culture that is sensitive to mental health. And what that means is, from a mental health perspective, that individuals feel safe to talk about how they're doing, how they're coping or not coping, or even if they're a journalist who has lived with depression for most of their life, that they can feel like they can talk about that to their manager when they join a team to allow their manager to understand, and maybe their, colleagues to understand how they function. And when they have periods of depression, what that would mean and what accommodation is needed. That demands, something called psychological safety. But psychological safety is more than that. It allows generally people to feel comfortable to talk openly about making mistakes or things that are not working well to managers throughout the organization. So that is a foundation. And the other thing that we know that is very important and successful is that most people are asking their managers for permission not to work after work hours, or not to be looking at their phone, once they go home, to take vacation, for example, if that's a tendency of not taking vacation. And role modeling, that managers make it explicit when, I think somebody put in the question, when can I ask my manager to when is it okay to take a mental health day? Well, that your manager would say, for example, and we can go into that, but that your manager would say, I'm taking an afternoon off, or I'm going out to the gym in the middle of the day because I need to blow off some steam, or, we just finished a big story and I need some downtime, or, Wednesday afternoon is for my kids, and this is what I'm going. So making that very explicit, and putting guidelines in place. So that's just a few very basic things that are very key. And again, in terms of just the everyday stress, which is quite high in journalism because of this always on culture, it's so important to create moments, whether they're micro moments during the day, as a team and as an individual, or moments of downtime after there's been, a rush for a deadline, or working on a big story, or whatever it is, or a crisis, some story evolves and you've been on it for several days, that there is a creation of moments of downtime. So there's a moment for managers to push, and there are moments to create these downtimes. So when we're on in that high adrenaline, and then when our bodies and our nervous systems could come back to a more relaxed, calm state, where we can replenish our resources so that we can run the next sprint, or for some, the next marathon. And that is a very basic burnout prevention tool, if you will. It's creating those waves and making sure and ensuring that you try as much as possible to create that in a small or bigger way for yourself, but that those guardrails are somehow instituted in a work rhythm and a work culture. That the human being is as important in the story as organizing the technology or whatever else is normally organized to take care of the human being.
Great. And I'm sure, Bruce, that you've been privy to a lot of great models in terms of newsrooms supporting mental health and their reporters. Are there any that stand out in particular? And I'm kind of curious that if you could implement one change in newsrooms, what would it be?
Well, I think it would actually be a kind of 3-level change. It's not a single change, because, as Kim said, the sources of trauma and the sources of stress are systemic and become even more important when it's the news organization itself is part of the problem, right? So it's a slightly complicated equation, but we, at least in our work at the Dart Center with news organizations around the world and across the lines of culture and language, have found a few things work really, really well. I'm going to apologize for my phone ringing in the background. It's going to keep ringing. A few things work really well. One is simply establishing a baseline of language and knowledge that everyone in the newsroom shares. In the newsroom, everybody knows what accuracy looks like. Everybody knows what fairness looks like. And it's really helpful at times to just do some basic trauma awareness briefings to make sure that people who, everybody knows how a bill becomes law or everybody knows how to cover the Super Bowl, has some understanding of the occupational health and safety issues connected to trauma and knows a little bit about how to look out for themselves and their colleagues. A little bit of basic self-care that everybody shares with some understanding of how the work affects them is one level. Secondly, second leg of the stool is to have newsroom leaders, which is to say managers, but also executives, and also informal leaders, people who may not have titles, but who are the mentors to everybody in the newsroom, get some special skill in having conversations with colleagues who may be in distress, in recognizing a few basic signs that someone isn't doing so well, right? All of those things are very straightforward skills to learn and make a big difference. Third, and most critically from all the research we know exists on journalists, the single factor most associated with journalists coping well and with resilience is trusting collegial support. And the single factor most associated with risk for PTSD or burnout, et cetera, is social isolation. This means there are a few practical policies to put into place. One of them is peer support. Some news organizations, like the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, this year the Washington Post, Reuters, a few others, have over time initiated formal, ongoing peer support programs where colleagues hold up their hand, get special training, and are there to be educators and to be resources for their colleagues, not therapists, not counselors, but peer supporters. But informal peer support also works, getting in smaller newsrooms training in how to look out for colleagues, what resources are there, all that sort of thing. Collegial support, trusting collegial support really matters. Leaders have a crucial role in this as well, because really thinking consciously about reinforcing teamwork, reinforcing shared responsibility and engagement with difficult decisions, operational debriefing, going over what went well, what was challenging, what did we learn that gives journalists more control and a kind of a journalistic purpose after a difficult assignment. Those kinds of things make a big difference. And finally, to bounce back to something Kim said, it's really crucial. Again, we know from lots and lots of studies of news organizations around the world that nothing amplifies trauma, threat, and burnout risk like a toxic workplace, right? And so taking care of the ecology of the pond, making sure that within small teams and within entire news organizations, bullying, bigotry, racism, gender harassment, all of those things are not tolerated is actually a big part of the solution. And then finally, I would be asking newsroom leaders, executives in particular, to contend with the idea, and again, this is bouncing off something Kim said, the idea of neurological downtime, neurological recovery time. Sometimes this is macro. This is I need a few days off or a vacation. It's that. Sometimes it's at the micro level, nano breaks, getting out and taking a walk, dealing with looking at other images, giving the brain a rest, and also in the workplace, really doing a granular review of workflows to make sure that no one is carrying an unfair or unnecessary level of stress, that workflows within a very particular newsroom are really optimized so that people can manage them, and setting sort of workplace livability standards as a KPI, right, is actually really important for journalism. Having a strategic plan for sustainability is something that we have an opportunity for now, still coming out of the pandemic, still reconstructing newsrooms. There's an opportunity to take all this concern about mental health that's out there and channel it in a very pragmatic way, and really identifying what the threat points are, what the trauma points are, what the stresses are, and what resources our managers and leaders need, what resources our newsrooms need. And I'll give you one other interesting example. Several big, most news organizations in industrial countries anyway, will have now employee assistance programs, right? Counselors who are on call. Trade secret, which will not come as a secret to anybody who's on a newsroom EAP. Most of them are not well set up for journalists, right? It's often a kind of counseling that is not qualified to handle people coming in with a heavy trauma load or super high stress. It's not oriented toward the sort of big challenges that journalists bring in. Some news organizations, NBC News, New York Times in the US, a few others internationally, have begun training their EAP counselors in journalism culture, so that there's a little bit more of a frontline capacity to deal with what newsrooms generate. And then I would also then add to that, finally, one little Dart Center project that we're really proud of, which Mariette mentioned at the beginning, is something called the Journalist Trauma Support Network. We, within the US, have been, for the last couple of years, training already experienced trauma clinicians in journalist culture and in the kinds of evidence-based treatment approaches that seem most effective in working with challenges that journalists bring in. These are all private practice clinicians. The Dart Center is not a clinic in any way. We're just an educational organization and a research organization. But training private practice clinicians who are already trauma experts in the specialized needs of news professionals. That's a model I would like to see many more newsrooms turn to, and many more clinicians available for, because I think while therapy is not the only answer, it may not even be the answer most of the time, when journalists do need therapy and they turn to someone who is unqualified or who doesn't understand trauma, or who doesn't understand in particular the distinct occupational culture of journalism, our colleagues get turned off by that. They run away from therapy and getting the help that they really need and that could make their lives better.
So let's talk about the individual journalist who might feel like they need to advocate for their own mental health in their newsroom. Can we reference a question that came in from someone who I know is a student, who asked, how can you respectively communicate to your news director that you need a mental health day to take some self-care? And so I want to ask for your very concrete advice, knowing that a student asked this. If you have a young reporter who maybe doesn't feel like they have earned the right to advocate for themselves, or they don't know how to do it, or if you are a journalist of color and you don't feel like there is support for you among leadership, and you're nervous about advocating for yourself and kind of reaching out about what you need, do you have advice for kind of what people can really specifically be doing and saying in order to really advocate for themselves in situations where they might need more support?
Well, I want to come back to something Bruce said, which is talking about these peer networks, whether formal or informal. I think it's very important to not feel alone in all of this when somebody is in distress. And it's reaching out for those that you feel safe and comfortable with, who may be a bit more senior as well. That always helps to have more, somebody who might have more influence than you do, but certainly not keeping it for yourself, and identifying your allies and your supporters. That's the beginning, is not keeping it to yourself, because you'll quickly realize, A, you're not alone. This is what I hear over and over again. One of the most important things that happens in the trainings that we give is that we create a space for journalists to talk about these issues, which are not about the doing of journalism, but the being of being a journalist. And very often that is not being talked about. So that's my first part of advice, is don't keep it to yourself. Share, seek out those you trust, find your allies, and see what might be possible or who may be able to advocate directly or indirectly on your behalf. And I have to also say that ignorance is a large part, I believe, of what is keeping work culture from evolving. It's not just ignorance, but I think that plays a large part, because I cannot tell you how many times I've started a training where somebody walks in and is very reticent about the topic and, blah, blah, blah. And why are we talking? This is the soft stuff. And by the end of the hour or an hour and a half, there's just a switch in mentality of, okay, more openness and understanding for why these issues might be important. And the last thing I want to say, there's a real economic argument too. And, if the human aspect of just, taking care of yourself, and the equation being, if you're in a better place, you're going to be more productive, you're going to work better. But there is really an economic argument to this for companies. How much money are they losing in absenteeism or in sick leave, or losing people, having to replace people, et cetera, et cetera. So there is some literature out there and some statistics out there that one can use to bring the economic argument upward. But I would say, don't hesitate from starting your own little revolution and look at what is possible. I'm constantly hearing journalists say, you know what, Kim, that's impossible. That's impossible because this is how it is. Or, we always have to be, or whatever the story is. And while a lot of that might be true, once you start thinking about what might be possible, there are some tweaks that can be done that don't cost a lot of money, that don't require you to go on a stillness retreat for 3 weeks or whatever it is, that nobody has the time, money to, or inclination to do. So start small, and don't keep it to yourself.
Speaking for myself, I would fail utterly at the stillness retreat. This is not a happening thing, right? As Kim said, socialize the problem. No matter what, do not isolate yourself if you're in distress. I would say that to young journalists, or if you're just concerned. And because we know that this is we're likely to feel overwhelmed at some point, it's a really good idea to proactively think about, as part of your own little self-care plan, who are my trusted role models? Who are my trusted colleagues? Who is the trusted manager in my newsroom, even if it's not my own boss? Who's the person I wouldn't touch with a barge pole? So that at the moment that you are really in need, you're not then, that's the worst time to begin racking your brain for, oh, who can I possibly talk to, right? It's kind of a plan to think through, well, who are my trusted colleagues? And not wait until there's a crisis, but just be in touch in a regular way. Secondly, though, again, bouncing off something crucial that Kim said, if you do feel unsafe for one reason or another in advocating for yourself, find an ally who can do it. It may be a peer. It may be a manager who's not your supervisor. It may be an HR person. It's going to vary wildly depending on the newsroom, but it is certainly okay to find someone who's an advocate. And you can also send your boss tip sheets from the Dart Center website or circulate resource materials in a general way to spark the conversation within the newsroom so it's not just about you. That's the other thing. If you're lucky enough to be in a newsroom with a union, talk to the union about it. If there is that, and I can tell you that the News Guild in the US, for instance, has become very active on dealing with mental health and trauma issues in its negotiations, right? There are a lot of different routes. The main thing is to understand that not only will you benefit in a practical way if you talk to someone else about it, not only will you benefit in a practical way, but it's actually good for your brain when you talk to somebody. When we socialize the problem, the very particular nature of burnout and trauma is to send us down spirals of isolation. So when we talk to somebody about it, hey, Kim, got 5 minutes? When we have that conversation, we are actually actively resisting the burnout or the trauma spin cycle, and reinforcing our own natural ability to cope. And if you do feel disrupted by the work, do know that this is not a one-way ticket to PTSD or something like that. In fact, there are very practical ways of managing this, skills you can learn from colleagues, self-care plans you can do, ways the workplace can protect you, which between them are very, very effective. There are parts of this job that we do get better at. There are ways of coping and nurturing resilience that we can learn. And if we are disrupted, there is help that makes a difference. While I'm not a psychotherapy pusher, for instance, and there are a lot of other pathways to getting help, the fact is that trauma-trained clinicians have a very specific skill set, short-term therapy, evidence-based stuff that is very well suited to a lot of what journalists encounter, right, on difficult assignments. And remember, too, that there is a huge range of human responses to stress and trauma. There is not a one-size-fits-all answer to this. And sometimes young journalists will come to me saying they're really worried about themselves because they're not feeling upset. And they're worried that they're getting too cold or being sociopathic, and they're actually becoming overwhelmed with anxiety. Sometimes we're wired in ways that help us cope pretty well with particular kinds of challenges. And sometimes that wiring can be overwhelmed too. Sometimes we will feel very distressed in the short run, but recover quickly in the longer run. Sometimes we'll be fine for a long time and then suddenly overwhelmed. There's a huge range of responses, and don't worry about being abnormal, either because you are reacting to some stresses or trauma in work, or because you're not. We don't want to pathologize ourselves here. We are a profession of copers, and we're also a profession in which there are ways of getting help that can make an enormous difference.
And never compare yourself to somebody else.
Yeah.
Ever, ever, ever. Never compare.
Yeah. And I'm gonna pile one on that. Not only never compare, but one of the worst things that journalists, old and young, do, in my experience, and I've done this, is compare ourselves to the sources, the individuals and families and communities we cover, who are in fact suffering enormously. We're a mission-driven profession, and so often I hear my trauma, whatever I'm coping with, doesn't matter because I need to be here for my sources, and it's their suffering that matters. We're all here with the same mission, but here's the reality. If you believe in being fully present for your sources, for the communities that you cover, if you believe in this mission of journalism, self-care and looking out for colleagues is an obligation as fundamental as verifying facts and checking quotes and writing headlines. Why? Because if we don't do those things, we're going to be overwhelmed and derailed from the job that we say we want to do. We will fail our sources and fail our communities if we're not prioritizing psychological safety, not prioritizing well-being, mental health, neurological recovery time, all of those things.
Thank you. We only have about 5 minutes left, so I'll ask you to kind of answer this a little bit quickly, but I wanted to ask something that I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds. For reporters who are based in the US, we are approaching a second Trump presidency very shortly. We know the rhetoric about the press that came out of the previous administration. What is your best advice for how journalists should be thinking about navigating the next 4 years from the standpoint of their mental health and safety?
Notice that we're both leaping to answer this, right? Kim, go, you take it first.
Well, it's a huge question, but I remember in preparing for this talk, Sarah mentioned this, and because I worked with journalists in countries in the early 90s, defending journalists who were being jailed and where there were legal threats. I was thinking back, you know, the journalists in the United States are going to have to are needing to learn what, you know, all the African journalists that I was working with whatever years ago were practicing. And all I can say is the threat is that whatever tactics and strategies are going to be used, it's going to be used to weaken financially and to weaken mentally and emotionally. And so it becomes a prerogative. Is that the word? Prerogative? No, not the prerogative. It becomes essential that self-preservation become a priority. And that means resourcing yourself, making sure that you're well-resourced, whatever that means, to be taking on the challenges rather than constantly doing. So preparing, resourcing yourself before, you know, the crisis occurs so that you can manage whatever's coming your way or navigate it in as skillful a way as possible. But just be prepared to be weakened mentally, morally, ethically. And so you need to resource yourself, create that inner strength, and both energetically, physically and mentally.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, first of all, self-care, yes. Solidarity. The point of these attacks is to fragment us as a profession. Stand up for the values of journalistic professionalism, which are being attacked every day. Recognize that in this era, every good story that you do, even if it's about guitars or garlic, every honest story is itself an act of refusal and resistance against and models kind of civic discourse. Read Maria Ressa's How to Defeat a Dictator, the story of a journalist who stood up to authoritarian thuggery in the Philippines, right? And recognize that as a profession, we are central to the whole country navigating this time. So how we look after ourselves, how we look after our ethics, how we look after press freedom is part of the pathway forward for our country.
On that note, let's end it there. Thank you so much to Bruce Shapiro and to Kim Bryce for such an inspiring and helpful conversation. There are some resources in the chat. And if people are interested in hearing more about the work that both Kim and Bruce do, you can check out Kim's organization is called The Self-Investigation. Bruce is the longtime executive director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University. Both are fantastic resources that we hope you take advantage of. We will be back with more COMtalks in January. So if you're interested in joining us for future events, please be on the lookout for that. But again, thank you so much to Bruce and to Kim for this amazing conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone who was here today. Keep on keeping on.